So let me just introduce the panelists. Right next to me is Father Dominic Legg. You've already met him. He is the director of the Thomistic Institute. He studied his undergraduate at Claremont McKenna and then got a JD from Yale University and was a practicing constitutional lawyer for several years before he joined the Dominicans. And then he went on to do what Dominicans typically do, study philosophy and theology. And he is now he's an assistant professor in systematic theology at the Pontifical Faculty of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C. Dr. Frederick Simmons is my colleague here at Princeton Theological Seminary. He's currently teaching a class on faith and science, and he's the leader of a project funded by the John Templeton Foundation on biology, cosmology, and theological ethics. Dr. Simmons got his PhD at Yale University and was also an assistant professor in the Yale Divinity School, and he's also been a fellow at the Center for Theological Inquiry here in Princeton. And also, my colleague here at Princeton Theological Seminary is John Bolin, who teaches, he's a professor of philosophy and Christian ethics. He got his master's and PhD across the street at Princeton University. And he teaches courses on ethics, the problem of evil, ethics and politics, and Augustine, friendship, love, and justice. We will start, actually, our first presenter will be Dr. Simmons, followed by Dr. Bolin, and then Father Legg.
Margarita, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be on this panel and to participate in the conference. More broadly, I'd like to thank you for this initiative as a whole, that is to say, bringing together faith, science, and nature. From a popular perspective, there's a presumption that this cannot be done. On the one hand, we're all familiar with the vociferous, often vitriolic new atheists who contend that because of science, faith is a delusion. And on the other hand, I think we're also familiar with certain religious groups that think that based on their reading of Scripture, science is not true. So from those vantages, something like this is not possible. I think from the vantage of Princeton Theological Seminary, those seem like outlier positions, easy to dismiss. But something that comes a little bit closer to home is not so much the concern that this can't be done, but that there's no point in doing this. That is to say that though faith, science, and nature are not incompatible, they're ultimately incommensurate. We see this on both the scientific and on the theological side. On the side of the scientists, perhaps this is most well known, I was going to say notorious, but most well known in the voice of Stephen Jay Gould and the notion of non-overlapping magisteria, often associated with a little limerick of his that he popularized, it didn't initiate with him, that science gets the age of rocks, religion gets the rock of ages. Science gets how the heavens go, religion gets how to go to heaven. So this seems urenic. Science can do its thing and religious people shouldn't be worried. Likewise, religions can do their thing. Scientists don't need to go tell them that they're delusional. But from this perspective, there's no point in having a conference like this because the two views have nothing to say to one another. They're just simply incommensurable. There are theological persuasions that effectively take the same position. And as I mentioned, these may hit closer to home for folks here. For example, I think it's fair to characterize Bardianism as effectively taking this view. As Professor Mooney mentioned, I spent some time at Yale. So-called Yale theology or post-liberal theology, I think amounts to the same thing. Some kinds of radical orthodoxy, I think, amount to this. Some kinds of postmodern theology amount to this. So again, from this perspective, a conference like this is not impossible. It's just irrelevant. So in that sense, as I say, I think that this is something to recognize and appreciate, that it's a specific kind of way of thinking about science and religion that makes a conference like this both possible and productive. And that way of thinking about both science and religion is a way that we find in Thomas Aquinas and in John Calvin. So it's eminently fitting that the Thomistic Institute and PTS would be sponsoring such a conference, but I don't want us to take for granted that that is the only way to think about the potential relationship between these two domains. As we've heard throughout the day, particularly with our first talk this morning, what was true for Thomas is also true for Calvin, the presumption that there is a unity of truth. Truth can be known both through the sciences and through the scriptures, and that it's through unifying these two sources of truth that we learn more about both. And therefore, that there's a Christian vocation to inform ourselves as Christians about the natural world through science and other means, and that that informing helps us understand the Bible, God, and our role as disciples. So why then bring science, faith, and religion together? If it is the case that they can be mutually informing, well, what kind of informing ought we expect? What kind of informing indeed has occurred? Here I think it's important to reflect that although the academic discipline that studies this connection now goes under the banner of religion and science, it's difficult, probably impossible, to say anything useful about the relationship between religion and science if you think in terms of religion and science. Religions are not monoliths. Religion itself is not monolithic. There are different religious traditions. These differences matter when we talk about the relationship between religion and science. There are differences within religious traditions. These also matter. The same is true for the natural sciences. So one comment that came up after Stephen's talk was, well, what are we to make of the fact that it seems that physicists or physics can lend itself to a kind of theism, but if I understood the question correctly, biology seems less congenial with theism. To the degree that there's something to that, that already is helping us recognize, I think, that differences in the sciences make a difference. And also notice what we're discussing. We're talking about theism. We're not talking about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or the God of Jesus Christ. And I'll just add something to the answer that Steve gave to that question. I think one of the reasons that there's tension on the biological side, and many of the so-called new atheists are biologists, or at least claim a kind of biological credentialing, are straightforwardly theodicy problems. When you're talking about physics, you're not talking about life, and so theodicy is just not germane. Once you move over into the biological sciences, you're talking about organisms, theodicy problems emerge. This panel is devoted to ethics, and so I want to say in closing just something to help us perhaps get our bearings a bit when we think about the relationship between faith and science from an ethical vantage. And here I'm going to modify a set of options that was developed by Henry Sidgwick in the beginning of the last century in a book called Methods of Ethics. I'm going to be modifying very heavily, but nonetheless, I'm drawing from Sidgwick's 3 options. So one way of thinking about ethics is that it's about attainment. And by attainment, I mean realization of one's own proper potentials or one's own good. Sometimes in a class on normative ethics, this would be called eudaimonism. Sidgwick himself called it egoism, by which he meant ethical egoism. I don't mean to ally differences between eudaimonism and ethical egoism, but nonetheless, what I'm calling attainment is this notion that it's about realizing one's own proper potentials or realizing one's own good. there's another way of thinking about ethics, which I'm going to call promotion. And that's realization of proper potentiality or goodness per se. That is, not simply one's own proper potentials or one's own good, but the presumption that ethics is about realizing proper potentials and goodness in themselves. This is often associated with utilitarianism. Sidgwick sometimes calls it universal benevolence, but in any case, it's a second way of thinking about ethics. Attainment on the one hand, promotion in the middle, and then finally, a third way of thinking about ethics with respect to religion and science, I'm going to call it respect. And here, the notion is that ethics is about treating potentiality or the good appropriately. So in a class on normative ethics, this will often be affiliated with what's called deontology. Sidgwick associates this with what's called intuitionism. So there are different ways of labeling these three options, and these different labels are slightly different, but for our first approximation here, we can see these as discrete ways of thinking ethically about questions that are raised by the connection between religion and science. These three ways can be integrated. I'd simply note that it's difficult to integrate them if you try to maximize any one of them. I guess the last thing I'll say is, well, what might dispose one to one of these three options? And here, lots of different reasons could dispose a person to any of these three possibilities. I'll simply note that virtue traditions often prioritize attainment. And perhaps that's a very positive way of framing it. I think a more potentially nefarious way is to think that as we go forward, especially in the context of what we heard last night with biotechnology, no doubt commercial interests will emphasize attainment. Often humanitarian considerations will motivate what I'm calling promotion. And then finally, think of something like a capabilities approach. And then finally, I think frequently theological considerations motivate something like respect, where often you'll have principles first of so-called negative duties, doing no harm, non-maleficence, that respect means that certain things are impermissible despite the good that might be done for others by doing them. So in a theological idiom, think of the notion, we may not do evil that good may come. I think I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're gonna see the different styles of someone who went to Yale and someone who went to Princeton. Okay. Put bluntly, the Yale guys like typologies. We Princeton guys don't. Okay. So I'm not gonna have any, and this is another way of excusing myself. I'm not in any ways organized as Fred is. So. And part of the disorganization is that when Professor Gorman mentioned Vicky Hearn, my brain just melted because I have lots to say about Vicky Hearn. So I'm going to try to get to that straight away. My students in the room know that almost in every class I teach, I get around to recommending the second chapter of her book, Adam's Task, which is How to Say Fetch, which is her exegesis of Wittgenstein's first language game in the philosophical investigations, the one called Slab, right, where there's a construction site. I'll get to her, because I'm going to talk about dogs. So I want to talk about. I'm going to pose two questions, and then I'm going to talk about her. The first set of questions are directed to Father Brent, and I think fascinating discussion of form and finality, and the closing remarks on the Forest River Thomists, where that move where there's a possible rapprochement between something like an Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysics and natural science, built on a distinction between general and particular. And so I take it the metaphysics was to provide a general account of form and finality, basically identifying an object of scientific inquiry. And then you have scientific inquiry. But this is a panel on ethics, so I want to tease out, this is a question maybe for later conversation. I'd love to hear more about the normative consequence, not simply of the account of form and finality, but of general and particular. And I'm thinking of constraints on human action in particular. Presumably human beings have a certain kind of form, ordered to certain kind of ends. That would be the general level. And then presumably that general level creates some normative constraint, some normative boundaries. It'd be good to hear what those are, and then what the particularity is. Right? So in other words, I take it the particularity is the realm of maybe rational inquiry about proximate ends, choices to be made, institutions to be endorsed or criticized, and so on. But then it'd be interesting to hear what's the relationship between the possible normative constraints that emerge from the general level, from the fact that we're human beings of a certain kind, ordered to certain ends. What constraints come? And I take it that that's the question that drives the whole project of natural law theory, right? And I take it the hope of natural law theory is that at that general level, the metaphysical level, there can be normative constraints that affect what goes on at the particular level. And I mean, I take it that's the contested area. I'd love to hear more about that. I guess there's one other thing I'd love to hear about. I was thinking about an article one of our former students wrote on Bob Adams's ethical theory. This is David DeCosimo, now teaches at Boston University. And he has questions about our capacity to tease out human interest as we specify form and finality. So his example is strawberries. So what makes for a good strawberry? Well, presumably a good strawberry, according to the form and finality picture, is one that conforms to form. And what would that conformity be? Well, it would be plump and red, and the little green top would be fresh, and there would be succulence associated with it, and the seeds would have all that shininess about them, and that would be a strawberry, a good strawberry, by virtue of its conformity to form. DeCosimo says, well, that sounds pretty good. The problem is we have multiple interests that might influence how we think about strawberries. So he imagines a food fight. So what makes for a good strawberry in a food fight? Well, not the one I just described. You want the soggy one, the one with the mold growing on it, and it barely holds together, and when you throw it and it hits your enemy, it makes that splatting noise, right? That's an excellent strawberry, not the other one. And he pushes this argument in part to put pressure on Bob Adams's account of excellence and resemblance. But it also can be used to put pressure on the notion of form and finality. The question would be, I suppose the comeback would be, well, we have to distinguish between substantial and accidental form. Thank you. No, right, but then the question becomes, have we tethered that distinction between substantial and accidental form to our own arbitrary interests? Because the interest at stake in describing the plump, juicy one that seems to conform to form, the substantial form, is linked to our interest of eating. And the other one is linked to our interest of food fighting. This is just a question put on the table. The second set of questions I wanted to ask were directed to Margarita Mooney's talk, which I thought was excellent and exciting. Where's Margarita? Oh, there you are. God bless you. Here's my question. And is this the right way to read your lecture rhetorically? It felt like I was being pushed toward an existential choice. It was kind of like that chapter in After Virtue where it's either Nietzsche or Aristotle. It felt like it was either soulless secularism in social science or theologically laden, metaphysically rich social science, that these were my options. And I'm wondering if those are the options. So I'm thinking of our colleagues at the university, Mitch Denier and Matt Desmond. I'm looking at Eric for confirmation I'm getting the names right, yes? Yeah, they're both sociologists. Desmond he wrote that great book that some of you know about eviction in Milwaukee. Really powerful book. Mitch has written a couple of books on the south side of Chicago. One's called Slim's Table. I recommend both of them to you. Both of them are sociologists who have normative commitments. It's the normative commitments that are driving the work. And they're commitments related to the ideals of democracy. I don't know either of them that well. I've had some conversations about these matters with them. I don't think either of them have a big metaphysical account of what they're doing and of their own normative commitments. And I'm wondering whether we can't just go ahead and do the kind of normatively charged social science that they're doing without seeking agreement on the highly contested theological and metaphysical matters that has been going on here today. In other words, do we have to get straight on that before their work is authorized? Can't they just do their work? That's a question. So Coco, the gorilla. In Hearn's book, I think in chapter 1, so the title of the book is Adam's Task, subtitled Calling Animals by Name. Hearn was a poet who taught at Yale half the year, and an animal trainer who worked in Hollywood half the year. Okay, so she was the animal trainer who made the Disney animals do the amazing things. Okay, a deeply morally serious person. The opening chapter has a discussion. I don't know if it's Coco, but one of the other signing chimpanzees. And I think she goes to the Emory primate lab and hangs out with the signing chimpanzees, right? And the claim, of course, is that they share 98, 99% of our DNA. And Professor Hulbut last night said, well, so what? They don't seem all that human. Hearn agrees. And here's the kicker. She thinks her well-trained dog is more human than Coco. And here's why. I mean, she puts it rhetorically. Where does Coco sleep at night? In a cage. I don't know if Coco does, but the chimpanzees she worked with at the primate lab at Emory, they sleep in a cage. Why? Because they'll rip your throats out at night. Even though they might know 500 sign language concepts. My dog Ulysses, he's part bloodhound, part yellow dog, who knows? He sleeps at the foot of our bed. Okay. And this bears on the question that Professor Hulbut was asking about human-animal interactions. This is a panel on ethics, so I'm going to talk about the normative interaction, the moral interaction. When we ask about what's distinctive about human beings, one of the things we should mention is that we domesticate a certain collection of animals. It's just a small collection. You'll remember when God speaks to Job out of a whirlwind. Go to chapter 39 of Job. The principal distinction is between domesticated and wild animals. God says, does the wild ass sleep in your shed? right? What about the wild ox? What about the ostrich, right? The contrast being drawn is between those animals that share our life and sleep in our sheds and at the foot of our beds and those that don't. What distinguishes them? Hearn has an account. Hearn says, a dog becomes a perfect instance of the kind of thing that it is. In other words, fully a dog only as it takes on aspects of a human life. Because that's what a well-trained dog does. They participate in human activities, fetching, guarding, hauling, right? Americans have a view of a well-trained dog. It's the golden retriever lying on the heating grate on a cold day, kind of overweight, kind of leaning on the dog dish, and you just do that all day. Hearn's idea of a happy dog is one that has a purpose. It's a purpose that it can take on, be informed by, only as it's properly trained by a human being and takes on certain human ends and activities. And that its full dignity and full excellence as a dog only comes into existence as the divide between human and animal is actually crossed, blurred. Anyway, so 2 questions and an endorsement. Everyone should go read that book. And I'll say one more thing about that book. We at the seminary, Protestants care a lot about divine command. So that essay on how to say fetch is the best account of command and obedience you'll ever find. Maybe in Thomas's treatise on law, they're tied. Okay, I'll say that, but it's pretty close.
Thomas's treatise on law is not about divine commands. I'll just start with that. That's just by way of being polemical. Yeah. No,
You and I disagree about this.
And we should talk about dogs and cats and
Promulgation, I
all
believe.
these things. Yes. So I have lots that I would sort of, on a very flippant way, say along those things. But I thought I actually have just some very brief remarks which are sort of pulled from aspects of the conference as I was listening to the things that were being said, trying to give in kind of Thomistic fashion, insofar as I'm an aspiring Thomist, principles for understanding the relationship between faith and science, which I think are actually, in the end, very important for avoiding what I think is only an illusory conflict between the two. And so, in part, this is also by way of what I think is a kind of summary or recapitulation of some of the key elements that we've heard, although perhaps not formulated quite this way. So 4 principles. The first one, which I think has been presupposed by really all of our speakers, and probably would have a very wide agreement in the room, the absolute transcendence of God. That is, God is not a part of the universe, but is its absolutely transcendent cause. And so God does not relate to the world in the same way that the things in the world relate to each other. I think that's just a very fundamental first starting point to clarify. And Stephen Barr's discussion of how creation is not a starting point in time, at least according to Aquinas, but rather expresses a relation, and he didn't put it quite so finely as this, but for Aquinas, creation refers to a relation of absolute ontological dependence of all creatures on God, their creator. So that means to be a creature is to receive being, or to be caused, and therefore not to be in an absolute sense. So a corollary of this, which ties into the 4th principle that I'm going to get to in just a moment, God cannot be investigated in the same way that other beings in the universe can be investigated. So we should expect there to be a difference in the method or in the type of science we're talking about. Science in the Thomistic sense of the word as a discipline or a sort of knowing, a field of knowing, you might say. Okay, second principle, and closely related to the first, this was brought up by Father James Brent, the distinction between primary and secondary causality, which we didn't really discuss in a systematic way, and I assume a lot of people here have heard of that distinction before, but let me just very briefly recapitulate it. God, because he's the cause of the whole universe and cause of all other beings, he's a cause of a radically different kind than creatures are causes. And he gives creatures their being itself, and hence their capacity to be causes. So that means that when we analyze creaturely causality, which is extremely important for us as creatures to take measure of, and this is really what empirical science investigates, creaturely causes or creaturely causality, it's very real and it's very important, but it is a different sort of causality than God is exercising. And when you begin to confuse these orders of causality, you enter into lots of theological confusions, or you begin to think that God, we need God to explain phenomenon which actually perhaps science could investigate and discover some cause, God of the gaps problem, that sort of thing. Okay, that's the second principle. Much more could be said there. The third principle, which didn't come up too much, but I did hear it in some of what Steve Barr spoke about, God's providence. Steve Barr spoke about the pervasive background presence of a profound order and intelligibility in the universe. And an example would be, say, the laws of physics, which are just always there. And actually, it's things like this that make science possible, insofar as we presuppose that we can discover something intelligible, something knowable, in the world around us. And of course, that does really presuppose that there is already an order in reality. Aquinas' view is that because God is the source of all created being, he's also the source of all of the order found in the universe, and that therefore he is also able to account for and guide everything in a qualitatively different way from any other creaturely perspective. So that means that, now this is something that I find very interesting in Aquinas. It's not the case with all medieval theologians or philosophers, but Aquinas very clearly, and here we get away from a sense of obedience and obligation in the moral sphere, God's creative activity and even his willing of creation is guided by the wisdom of his intellect, or by the plan of order he conceives in his divine mind for the universe, which Aquinas says is a kind of law for his willing. It's interesting. So even God's will has a law to it, which is not in the order of willing, but in the order of intelligibility, in the order of God's intellect. And God brings about reality through different orders of secondary or creaturely causes. And there's a lot of different, well, a number of different orders of creaturely causes, all of which are under the universal causality of God. You have per se causality, you have chance causality, or per accidens causality, you have contingent causes, you have free causes. And that God actually can even work in or through these creaturely causalities. Fourth principle, and we're getting to the end. The formal objects, this is a Thomistic way of framing this point, the formal objects of experimental sciences are different from those of philosophy and theology. So these are different kinds of inquiries, and therefore they use different methodologies, but they are not attaining any less to the truth, nor can they be measured by the same standards, for example, of empirical verification. So some very simple examples, I think, bring this to light. A physicist, and we talked about this in Dr. Hurlbut's talk last night, a physicist can build a nuclear bomb, but cannot answer, qua physicist, whether using the bomb in these circumstances is justified. So, in fact, there is no empirically verifiable experiment that one could run to determine the justice or injustice of dropping a nuclear bomb. But it's an extremely important question. And, I mean, one that's of grave existential importance. And it admits of a real answer, in fact. So, there must be another order of knowledge that does not depend on the experimental method of natural science, but nonetheless gives us something truly based in reason and something that is extremely important for our existence or our life. In fact, I would say it requires philosophy or also theology. Likewise, to speak about theology for a moment, you cannot do a test on the right arm of Jesus to determine if he is true man and true God. That's simply not detectable by any experimental method. Now, biology could investigate Christ's humanity, but not his divinity. So that's something that only theology actually is competent to investigate. So, generally speaking, we could think about the different domains of human knowing and the methodologies that they require, and then understand how these methodologies may be complementary, but not, in fact, one ruling out the other or canceling it out. So if you have a roommate, here, if you have Princeton University students who have a roommate, you could investigate your roommate as an object of biology, as a living organism. You can investigate your roommate as an object of physics, someone you're going to throw out the window. You could investigate your roommate as an object of psychology, the neurotic behavior he displays. You could investigate him as an object of moral philosophy, as possessing virtue, natural virtue. You could also investigate him or her as an adopted son or daughter of God by grace. And of course, that would require a theological inquiry. You can't do that by the scientific method. But these things are all really important, and they're complementary ways of speaking about it. Now, there's more that I could say, but I think I'll stop there, and then maybe we can get in an argument about dogs and cats and
Natural law.
chimpanzees and so forth, or wherever we'd like the conversation to go.
Well, actually, it's funny you say that because a couple of the questions were asking for a little bit of conflict. They said there was a lot of talk here about integrating faith and science and not enough talk about conflicts between faith and science, or even conflicts or disagreements among the presenters. But I do want to, I have to respond to John Boland's question to me briefly, and then tie it into this, I think, the larger pressing questions of the seminar. I would say, at least I tried in my presentation to get across that I do think there's plenty of good social science done that's not in agreement with my own normative commitments or meta-theoretically spelled out, and I think that would be the same thing for biology or something like that. But I would say, having been in the social sciences for a long time and having done a 3-year project on philosophy of social science, it is pretty clear to me in sociology as well as in biology and other fields we've heard, if you are open that your normative commitments are theological or theistic, it's really hard on your career.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think if I leaned heavily on the side of let's bring theology directly back in qua theology, it's because I've seen it pushed out really hard. And I've seen this boundary drawn very, very strongly. And I also think that as much as people like Mitch Denier and Matt Desmond produce great pieces of work with really great normative commitments that you can see, I think we live in an area where the normative commitments to democracy and equality and freedom and human dignity are under attack. And I think there's a debate to be had whether or not the normative commitment to human dignity upholds if you take out the idea that we have a soul. And so I wonder, for those who aren't directly going to do this work themselves, is the kind of work that we look at and say, hey, that's good, I agree with those normative commitments. We do need to have a spot in the university where the origins of these normative commitments, their theological origins, need to be discussed. And I think that we'll get more of the kind of good sociology you described if we had a place where theology, qua theology, had a place at the table to be discussed. So that's, and I think with regards to some of the, some of the questions that came in, I think that was one of the directions, or one of the original ideas for this conference is to talk about this fundamental question: is there a human nature, and what are the ethical implications of taking a stance on that? There are huge ethical implications for taking a stance that there is such a thing as human nature, and that there are ethical implications of the idea of human nature, which all of you talked about. So in terms of some of the other questions that I think we haven't gotten to, but I mean, what I just said, I think ties to a couple of the questions which maybe the other panelists can share their thoughts. Several of the questions we got from the audience really were about education. How does this apply in education? Because there seems to be some concern, I heard this over the coffees too, that the people who've chosen to come here today most likely came here because they're interested in theological contributions to all kinds of issues. But what is this, does this kind of conversation we're having here, can it happen in the university, right? Or where could it happen? Could there be a different way of doing science education? Could there be ways to bring back these kind of directly theological thinkers in different fields, not just in people doing theology? Does anyone have any thoughts on that? On education? Well, we're doing it, sort of.
Yeah, I mean, I can say a few things. I mean, so one is, I completely endorse your call for a kind of methodological reflection in fields outside of theology that enables theological commitment to have a place, that they're not scapegoated or excluded at the start. That just seems crucial to me, and I think you're right that much of what's going on, much of what has gone on over the last couple of generations in the American Academy is that those theological commitments and even just moral commitments, normative commitments of any kind get pushed to a side. My only caveat, my worry is, and this is the source of my question, is I want people like Mitch and Matt to do their work. I find it morally and politically enormously important. And the concerns about human dignity that animate their work, I want those concerns expressed in the work that they do. If they need to ground that concern in human dignity in a collection of theological commitments or metaphysical assumptions in order to do the work, I don't think they'd do it. I just don't think they have the interest. So I kind of want it both ways. I want it possible to get what you want, Margarita. Metaphysics, ethics, theology brought into what are mostly secular conversations, while simultaneously letting people like Mitch and Matt do their work without coming to agreement or conclusion about those deeply contested matters.
I can add briefly that I think that this conversation points up the significance of something like the Dominican House of Studies, something like the Thomistic Institute, something like Princeton Theological Seminary, that universities, by dint of their role in pluralistic societies, necessarily cannot properly presuppose any single metaphysical framework, any single theological orientation, or any single normative vision. And thus, we cannot presume that universities can do all the work that we hope to do as inquiring human beings, because we've seen throughout this conference the significance of theological, metaphysical, and normative commitments to this work. And thus, I think, in a way, what this conference helps to attest to is the significance of these other institutions working in tandem with universities to get this more comprehensive picture.
So another question for the panelists on a different topic was that several of the talks have mentioned wonder, and somebody asks if we could talk more about the role of wonder in the life of faith, but also in the intellectual life, and how can we recover a sense of wonder when we live in a culture that seems to try to just constantly stifle contemplation and silence.
Well, if I can jump in on that, I think I would say two things informed by conversations that I had just earlier today with participants here. One, about study and contemplation, or scientific investigation and contemplation for that matter. I mean, we heard from a number of people about the way that you can, wonder can be aroused as you contemplate the beauty and order in the universe. And, you know, there's all kinds of different people who testified to that. I think that's, of course, very good. What is the place of contemplation in the intellectual life? Or, I mean, another way to ask this would be, what's the point of our being the kinds of creatures who can know? And ultimately, the answer to that, I think, is, well, God has made us with intellects so that we can know him, and, of course, all that comes from him. And in a certain way, we know him in what he has created, especially in this life, but one day we hope we will see him face to face, and that is the purpose of our minds, really. And so, all of our study, I would hope, would eventually be oriented or referable to that, even if in a very particular, concrete way. You know, we don't immediately refer our, you know, the work you're doing in your chemistry class to that. But in the long term, that you do see how, in fact, in a certain way, you're ordering your life to God. And this, in the Dominican tradition, is the purpose of study, that it is actually also a contemplative activity that allows, especially when you're doing philosophy, but supremely in theology, that you, by using your mind, you love God with your mind, as Jesus actually commands us to do. So that's great. That's why he's given us minds. Let's do more of that, and it gives glory to God as we're able to do that. But then the question about there was a second aspect that I was going to mention. Oh, about how we can purify our study. And here I think actually something that Father James Brent was talking about is, I mean, I agreed very much with what he was saying about the need to purify the explanation or elaboration of the data that natural science is able to gather. So you have, in a certain way, it seems to me maybe three levels. You have the gathering of the data points. You have eventually you may have a kind of theory that emerges from that, or a hypothesis anyway of what that, how to interpret the data, what it means. Eventually you're hoping to arrive at a perhaps even a mathematical expression, which is expressing the relationships. The mathematical expression is more reliable than the explication and the analogies that we use to elaborate what we've observed. And there's always the risk that we're smuggling in something that is not actually in the data in our elaboration of our explanation. That's where I think a kind of humility before the mystery that we're encountering, that we don't simply plummet all the way to the depths. We have to recognize that there is something here that we are struggling to fathom, and that even with created things, that's going to continue to be the case. I mean, all the more so, of course, when we're talking about supernatural mysteries, but even natural things have this dimension of mystery, which evokes a kind of wonder, but also requires a kind of humility before them.
So another question that was in the index cards, and I think it also came up in some of the questions on specific panels. We've heard a lot about Aristotle. We've heard a lot about Thomas, especially in relationship to the question of human nature and teleology of human nature. Are there other theological resources to think about teleology that are not specific? You mentioned Calvin, Fred, but I mean, that was a question people have been asking. Are there other theological resources for this question other than Thomas and Aristotle?
Why would you need any more?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think.
the Dominican.
Thomas is kind of the best on this.
That's a joke, yeah, but maybe it's true.
But I think it's true.
Just because maybe it's true doesn't make it true. That's what I learned from Michael Gorman.
I think the short answer is absolutely. And there's a reason that the Christian tradition is so rich. I mean, one thing that comes to mind, John and I were talking earlier, Augustine is another perfect example of a teleological Christian thinker who's not coming from an Aristotelian perspective, but nonetheless is thoroughgoingly teleological. And one could continue to simply enumerate exponents of the tradition that have a teleological cast of thinking. So I think the resources are extremely robust in this regard. And from my vantage, it's something to celebrate, that the tradition has different ways of thinking teleologically, and it has ways of thinking that are not teleological at the same register. And hence, there's really a panoply of different options. And as we've seen today, the Thomistic is one that's extraordinarily sophisticated and is impressively powerful.
I think maybe I think you probably could say even biology textbooks, as Father James Brent was talking about, contain this. So it's not, it's not even so much a question of whether you need a theorist to come up with an account of teleology, but that it's a feature of reality, and we encounter it all over the place, and we have a very hard time living without it. So even in physics and places where it might seem difficult, more difficult to discern it than in, say, biology, it smuggles itself back in, or we discover that we've smuggled it back in, or however you want to put it. So I think it's a kind of it's simply a fact about reality, and we can explicate it more or less clearly. I think you're right about Augustine too, and of course there are many others in the patristic age who would have that view.
Well, I have also grouped together a kind of last final set of questions, and I have decided that I am going to end this panel and end this conference leaving you on a big cliff here, because somebody wrote on an index card in giant letters, all caps underlined with question marks, "So, how is the world going to end?" Somebody else wrote, "Given our current understanding of the universe, what is the future of the cosmos and the human race? Can time have an end?" I won't ask our panelists to answer those questions. You're going to have to come back for another conference. But I will tell you that our time together has come to an end. And thank you so much for being here. Thank you to Princeton Theological Seminary, to Scala, to the Thomistic Institute, to our generous benefactors, panelists, everyone who helped organize this, especially Emily Sullivan. And please do come back for more. Thank you.